Hey everyone, so I had a request to make a video talking about the space in between cognitive functions, or cognitive processes, if you will. So it's always important to bear in mind CPT views type on a spectrum, and this therefore applies to the constituent parts that comprise a type. So if we're talking about, NITI, kind of introverted intuition using introverted thinking as an auxiliary, we're not necessarily saying it's the furthest possible extreme of that pairing, any more than we would be saying extroverted intuition and extroverted thinking as a pairing would be the furthest possible extreme of its orientation. And honestly, when dealing with individual differences, preferences tend to be more mild than they are extreme. So yeah, when we're talking about an INFJ's dominant pairing, we're not necessarily saying it's going to be exactly the same level of introversion as that of another INFJ's. This is why ambiverted types exist on the other side of the argument. People who might inhabit a space in between ENFP and INFJ. Capturing type on a spectrum and giving individuals the recognition in their own levels of uniqueness that they deserve requires viewing functions themselves on a spectrum. And people have found this really useful in understanding how cognition is fluid, always moving and changing. Dip functions, for example. Gateways and pathways within CPT even jumping to different networks. But as dipping itself implies, we're not always going from one extreme to another. And I don't believe people can be properly understood using extremes. But extremes nonetheless give us a kind of categorical foundation in order to start mapping the space in between those two extremes. And when we get into the realm of neuroscience, or at least what we understand of neuroscience so far, things are operating at a pretty high frequency. So even if things are dichotomous in the brain, it's either this thing or this thing, introversion or extroversion, rather than a true space in between. The frequency of oscillation between different brain networks is going to be so fast as to essentially have its own frequency pattern. A frequency pattern might be leaning more towards ambiversion, for example, than either introversion or extroversion as a general preference. But with that kind of science geeking out of the way, let's talk about a few different cognitive pairings and how we can understand a spectral approach to cognitive functions. What do functions look like in the middle of two extremes? As many of you know, CPT bases itself upon precise mechanistic processes of cognition. It's not just talking about wishy-washy emergent properties that we can associate with a certain preference for thinking one way over another one, and has much more to do with things we can actually track on the minute level. Sensing versus intuition, for example, is no longer understood as this kind of, concrete versus abstract continuum. Instead, all of the symptoms that people might associate with extroverted sensing, for example, are simply emergent kind of traits of a preference for perceiving information in a certain kind of way. So let's compare maybe extroverted intuition, extroverted thinking to extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking. And the reason I'm not just using extroverted sensing or extroverted intuition on their own here is because by talking about extroverted thinking, we are giving it a rational agenda. In this particular case, we're talking about pairings that are more concerned with the objective external world than maybe emotional energies of other people. So with SETE, for short, we're going to have something more like this. We're going to have someone much more precisely locking into something singular and precise and intense in external reality. Extroverted intuition, on the other hand, is going to be more like this. It's going to be much more contextual. What's the overall scene? What's the movement within the scene? So SETE would be a little bit more hard semantic, and NETE would be a little bit more soft, impressionistic. So these are useful concepts to talk about two extremes of human cognition, but they're not necessarily painting exactly what's happening for two distinct individuals. Two people may definitely have a preference for one over the other, but it may be more mild. So we have NETE over here, SETE over here. Maybe one person's a little bit more like this, and the other person's a bit more like this, rather than that versus that, which is obviously going to be more extreme. So imagine the furthest extreme of SETE. This is when we're getting really intense, really macroscopic. It's when we're really focusing upon a very specific thing in front of us, like my oversized guitarist thumbnail right now. As you can see, I'm focusing on it with a lot of intensity. But what about if I look at my overall hand? Well, I've just expanded my view a little bit more. The object is larger and it has objects within the object. Okay, but what about this table that I'm using to film, or the camera in front of me? Well, suddenly I'm seeing a larger scene. And as I expand my viewpoint outwards, I can kind of give attention to the entire room around me. Everything becomes a little bit vague and blurry. I'm no longer really defining hard semantic properties, but I become much more aware of the context that I am in right now, the physical context, so to speak. So as you can see, there's many different levels that we can take these things. If you're dipping from SETE into NETE, a space in between might be, me looking at this table with a few different objects in front of it. So to go from SETE, you gradually expand your own attention. You're not necessarily jumping from, okay, here's a human hand, oh, here's the entire room. You're probably going to be more incremental. And likewise, if I'm suddenly really immersed within my own physical context with NE, I might be narrowing down into suddenly looking at this camera lens right now. If I'm really kind of hard baking a particular definition, really getting caught up on the exact meaning of a single word that I'm using in my effort to be as precise in my communication as possible, well, that would be quite an extreme TISI employment. But if I suddenly start talking about a general idea, a concept, a general framework, then I may no longer be concerned as much with the precise underlying vocabulary. So that's kind of like a TISI to NITI transition. And again, it's not always going to be those extremes. A lot of people might be more in the middle. One thing I believe MBTI got horrendously wrong is kind of misequating a preference with a strong preference. All the psychometric instrument itself cared about when I was analysing it in my course was just, do you have a preference at all? Well, yeah, people might have a preference, but the difference in preferences may be so negligible as to be insufficient reason to kind of create a type category, let alone force someone into one. So in the more spectral approach, we can kind of give people a more mild assessment without falling back to extremes. So what does the space in between SITI and NITI look like? Well, I use NITI a lot, and SITI tends to be something I evolve towards. It's something I'm working on, but I'm definitely not quite there yet. But as I do evolve towards using this pairing, I become a little bit more specific in the way that I speak. I become a little bit more sequential in the everyday actions that I take. NITI is more like, well, if I just generally do this kind of thing, 100 times over the course of my life, it'll be good. SITI, however, is much more deterministic rather than probabilistic. It says, if I do this, then this thing will happen. And currently I don't consider myself to be on either extreme. I certainly have a preference for NITI. And I certainly struggle with hard-baked determinism. But as I evolve as a human being, that preference becomes a little bit milder. I do things with greater intentionality, rather than just kind of being myself and hoping for the best. And I'm actually talking about more divergent forms of those pairings there, which is interesting because in the past I didn't really have much of an ESTP side to begin with. And I've already kind of put these pairings into a more divergent realm. Notice how I'm talking about actions I can take upon those pairings rather than their own internal formulation process. So I was actually more comparing my ESTP to ENTP side there, rather than my INFJ versus ISFJ side. And the latter is actually more my native kind of realm. And again, we can imagine a space in between these two pairings, because CPT actually considers there to be 32 cognitive functions, essentially. Because the difference between a divergent and convergent pairing is significant enough to warrant a new category. And all of these categories don't really truly exist. They're just terms of communication. They're words or concepts we use in order to kind of get a representation in every individual's head. But as CPT is a more mechanistic system, the categories it does use do get increasingly granular over time. And as they get more granular, the distance between them as a concept and something more observable shortens. So what about SITI versus NITI conversions then? Well, NITI conversions, as many of you have seen in this channel, is much more talking about concepts, overarching kind of patterns. It might be using one word and maybe even overextending its use because that one word encapsulates a general kind of concept and pattern rather than a specific meaning. And probably what you've seen over the course of the channel is my language getting a little bit less conceptual, a little bit less abstract. Still a little bit verbose, but definitely becoming more concrete. As my language becomes more concrete, I use a little bit more SITI. As I painstakingly, slowly get used to using concrete examples, again, I'm using more SITI. Okay, here's a concept, but here's an analogy for this concept. In this video itself, I've been using more SITI in order to more concretely communicate the essence of the concept I'm trying to get across. As CBT becomes more granular, talking about network theory, jumping between different types, mapping out more precisely the way in which cognition is fluid, I'm using more SITI. Because SITI is much more about if-then contingency. It's about a decision tree. If X happens, then Y happens in response. Which is kind of funny, actually, because a lot of people associate NI with kind of anticipating exactly what's going to happen in the future. But due to its vague nature, it just gets a general gist about it. It's actually SITI, which is much better at saying this is going to happen next. Although because it's a much smaller scope within the internal world, it's going to occupy generally a smaller timescale. Or even if not a smaller timescale, it's going to be much more precise and stepwise in its actions. And probably operate with less data overall. But what about the space between these worlds? We've talked about NETE versus SETE. We've talked about NITI versus SITI. Well, again, let's say I'm looking at a camera lens right now. I'm already doing a bit of SETE in order to focus upon its, kind of phenomenological properties. It's round, black. I'm describing its kind of general attributes as an object. So what I was doing then is essentially going from SETE to SITI. I was not only bearing witness to the existence of something and kind of interacting with it as I'm doing right now, but I was also labeling its characteristics. I was defining it. So here I'm kind of looking at something external and I'm describing it as I'm bearing witness to it. This is already a space in between SETE and SITI. A space in between NETE and NITI, on the other hand, well, I'm going to defocus from the camera in front of me right now, kind of get a sense of my own external surroundings. And now I'm looking more of kind of vaguely into space. It might appear like I'm still looking at the camera lens with the same intensity, but for the most part, I'm in a much more kind of contextual state right now. My own internal process is actually now becoming a little bit more abstract. It's resistant to labeling defined properties or describing something in a precise way. And that allows me to experience my own internal world as a more general impression. But right now I am in a more extroverted space. If I wasn't filming a video, my internal musings would be a lot more imaginative. But currently they're bound to what I'm currently talking about. They're bound to the external object and they're bound to the external context. And that's what a space in between NITI and NETE, SITI and SETE looks like. So even if on the brain level, we're actually seeing like a kind of very high frequency jumping between two extreme different modes of either outwards or inwards, in a cognitive process kind of way, it's still more accurate to describe this as a relatively ambiverted process because it's not really going into either extreme for any prolonged amount of time. So far we've talked about, the space in between introversion and extroversion. We've talked about the space in between, intuition and sensing. But what about relative degrees of convergence and divergence? This is another way, another dimension through which we can measure the difference between different cognitive processes. Well, in this case, we've already kind of solved it with the existing network structure of a type. You have the dominant and the agency. You have the oppositional and the authority. These two pairings are not equal in their degrees of convergence and divergence. They're actually kind of asymmetrical in a way. So even if the overall network is kind of symmetrical, kind of like a yin-yang symbol in Taoism, two cognitive elements don't pair together in a kind of mirroring fashion. As many of you watching this video will already be aware, I describe the agency position as hyperconvergent. I talk about the oppositional position as hyperdivergent. The extroverted feeling of an INTP is extremely divergent. It's much more focused upon observing and it has, a level of discomfort really getting into the interactive interplay of social interaction without, having very thoroughly assessed the boundaries before doing so. The FE authority of a ISFJ, for example, is going to be a little bit more fluid, a little bit more convergent. It's still primarily divergent, but it's not quite as extreme in its attitudes. So by looking at the element positions in an existing network structure, we can already get a sense of what the space in between two extreme attitudes looks like. The agency position of an ISFJ is going to be very locked in. They're going to know what they stand for opinion-wise, and they're going to have generally a resistance to being swayed by other people once they've made up their mind. An INTP, their introverted thinking can certainly be stubborn, but it's generally not going to be that stubborn. They're going to be more open to consuming information and updating their data banks according to the emerging concept. And these are not flat rules. CPT does not talk about things in absolutes. They're just tendencies. But by mapping these tendencies onto an existing cognitive network, we can get a sense for what the positions in between extremes of attitudes can look like, because the dominant and authority positions are not as extreme in their attitudinal preferences as the agency and oppositional, and I've made plenty of video content on that already. And we can extend this further because everything within CPT is a process. It's not talking about types as these kind of fixed and static categories that have their own kind of intrinsic value. A type itself is nothing more than a process within CPT. It's just another level of a cognitive function. So the reason why there's a type spectrum in CPT is the same reason why there's a cognitive spectrum. Why everything in this theory is a spectrum, effectively. So because CPT is a cognitive spectrum, it ergo has a type spectrum, because type itself is a process. So a person in between, let's say, ISTP and INFP, is gonna have their own cognitive quality to them. So yeah, people will be between INTP and ISFP. I see that quite a lot. So in understanding what, someone in between INTP and ISFP looks like, you just get a sense for what is FI and I versus TISI. And this actually brings us to the last section of this video. We've talked about, intuition versus sensing. We've talked about internal versus external. And we've talked about, convergence versus divergence and the spectrum within all of those different extremes. But of course, there's also a spectrum between the two rational poles, feeling and thinking. If I'm using introverted thinking here, while aware of my own cognitive biases, while aware of myself as this kind of emotional, nervous being, kind of producing thought in order to justify the emotions that I have, more of a sense of ease and control over my own agency in this world. I'm doing TI alongside FI. It's using introverted thinking with more of a sense of humility, knowing that I can't possibly have all the answers. Introverted thinking dipping into introverted feeling, inhabiting more the space in between these two things isn't necessarily going to be as detached, logical and erudite, but it will be more humble and aware of its own limitations and underlying reasons for saying the thing it's saying. Thinking doesn't occur just for its own sake. It usually has an underlying motivation, and that tends to come from feeling. If I'm using introverted feeling as a gateway instead of introverted thinking, I might be using introverted thinking as an extension of a kind of relational process. I might be imagining myself in the shoes of someone else, but also analyzing them. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I acting this way? If I was in this person's position, what would I be feeling? Using introverted thinking a lot here in order to brainstorm different possibilities, different simulations. In fact, simulation is the perfect word I'd use to describe the space in between FI and TI a lot of the time. And going back to TI dipping into FI, I'd say cognitive empathy can also be a form of TI into FI, for as long as you're actually getting affected by it. It's TI that, rather than removing oneself from the self, is still embedded within it. And what about TE dipping into FE? Well, here it's like, I have this goal I want to accomplish, just as an example, and here's someone who can help me with that. Oh, look, now we're a team. Now I'm suddenly invested in the community that we're creating in between each other. Maybe I'm invested in the community we are creating as we bring other people on to our project. Suddenly the project has its own life, and I'm not just caring about the goal or the overall pursuit of my introverted feeling satiation, but I'm also caring about the atmosphere that we are creating by undertaking this project together. And FE into TE is very similar. It's recognizing, okay, I do care about this general state of harmony, feeling integrated with the wider collective, even. It seems to be really nice and enjoyable when people have roles, when we can do things together, when we can actually achieve things for each other. So as you can see, the space here gets increasingly murky the further it goes in the middle. These two examples, they almost feel very similar to each other, because effectively they are, even if they do start from different origin points. If you imagine a space in between, even people being in between, for example, ESFJ and ENTJ, you'll get a bit of both rather than one or the other, but it won't be extremely goal-oriented necessarily either. So that concludes the video. I hope it's been informative, and please do share it with anyone who you think would benefit from imagining a more spectral approach to cognitive functions. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, I highly recommend you do so, especially right now, because I will be uploading quite a few more videos over the coming weeks and months. And if you're interested in supporting the theory in the channel on that additional level, I do recommend checking out the Patreon page as well. We have a really great Discord server over there, and I also do a live stream over there every month. So that's it from me, and I'll be back in a week or two, actually. For now, take care.